Okay, welcome. Tonight we turn things to our first expert lecturer of the course. And before I hand it over, just a note on the format. As always, the lecture runs about 60 minutes, followed by a Q&A. Feel free to submit at any time through the Q&A tool at Zoom, and I will hold the questions and moderate the discussion at the end. So our speaker tonight is Sean Gailmard, Herman Reyer Professor of Political Economy in the Department of Political Science at UC Berkeley. His most recent book, Agents of Empire, published by Cambridge University Press in 2024, argues that the core features of American government, federalism, separation of powers, independent legislatures, all of them trace their origins to the Crown's management of principal agent problems in the English colonization, well before the founding generation put pen to the paper. So please welcome Sean. You have the stage.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. A pleasure. Let me share my screen with you. Some slides. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Let me get that into full screen. Okay. There we are. So thanks again for the opportunity to join your class. It looks fascinating. I'm so interested in the feedback that you'll have to offer. Today, as we talk about the political economy of American institutions, I want to, based on the research I recently completed and have ongoing, recently completed for the book that Fernando mentioned, I want to tie it back to the imperial beginnings of the colonial project that England developed in North America and the Caribbean, starting in the early 17th century, really in the 16th century, if you take it all the way back to their first efforts. To understand the political determinants and economic incentives for the political determinants of the institutions of imperial governance that England developed. And I use the term imperial and empire advisedly. It is a term of some contestation, especially as applied to the very earliest period of colonization. Was there even such a thing as an English empire at this time? And what would that mean? Empire seems to connote something about a system of government linking different places together to a metropole. And one of the salient features of early governance in the English New World is sometimes apparently, and I will take exception with this and disagree with it, appears to be a lack of such a system. I don't think that's the right characterization of it, and that's one of the things I want to talk about. And so this map actually is a map that is an early occasion of the use of the term English Empire. This is from 1711 from a cartographer named Herman Mall. Now, that's quite a bit after the very earliest foundations, but this was a map that was available for the learned public of England in a pamphlet, a gazetteer, essentially, that would inform the readers about the world. Well, this was their picture of the English Empire in the New World. And they even had a sea called the Sea of the in this map, the Sea of the English Empire. So that kind of sets the stage for what we're doing here. And it relates, I think, really integrally to the theme of this class, and such an interesting time to talk about it in 2026, 250 years after the Declaration of Independence. And I think where we are and what you saw in this class last Tuesday is it's such an interesting topic because institutions of New World empires powerfully affected their successor states. And we have a great deal of evidence on this throughout the world, and we're coming to understand it better from a political economy perspective in North America as well. And that's kind of inspired by, or that concept is the inspiration for using this map. This map in this picture just shows early English colonial claims, territorial claims. This is a map from the early 18th century. The English claims are in pink. French claims are in green, but you can see these red lines extending all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. That's as far as the English land grants went, as far as the English crown was concerned. And that's kind of a visual depiction of those institutions of a New World Empire imposed on the successor state that became the United States. In the case of the United States, as we think about 250 years since the Declaration and then the Constitution writing period and the amazing work of some of the scholars you hear from later, uh, we look at their thinking about the institutions they put into the Constitution. But one of the points that was apparent to me, and that I argue in my book, and certainly an original to me, is that many of the institutions, discrete institutions used and deployed in the U.S. Constitution, are essentially re-theorized versions of institutions that were present in colonial government. They were not invented for the occasion of the US Constitution. Rather, they were inherited institutions directly as part of colonial government. And what I mean by that, in particular, institutions that turned into what we call federalism, institutions of separation of powers, and the institution of mutually independent states, which the Declaration of Independence presupposes to exist. They need to come together in this foundational act of unity to declare as a unit independence. That is that act of statehood, of founding a state in which mutually independent states come together to do that. So one of my points of departure in the book that I wrote is that the institutions of U.S. government, many of those built into the U.S. Constitution, are directly from colonial government. So if we want to understand the strategic and the political economic foundations of those institutions, we must therefore turn to their foundations in colonial government and understand why were they put there? Why did they stay there? So that's what I want to talk about today. How did the English colonies get these institutions? And the answer that I will present to you in part and elaborated in the book that I just wrote is that England did indeed have an empire. It governed this empire intentionally, albeit in a condition of immense ignorance in its earliest days, nevertheless intentionally, even with respect to that ignorance, it governed intentionally with both economic and security objectives. Its pursuit of those objectives in a system of government linking colonies to the metropole and pursuing the interests of the metropolitan crown through governance of these colonies is how the colonies got some of their foundational institutions, which came into greater flower in the US Constitution. So that's the argument that I will make. That is articulated and elaborated quite a bit more extensively in this book. Here's a picture of the cover, Agents of Empire, English Imperial Governance and the Making of American Political Institutions. That's with Cambridge University Press in 2024. As Fernando said, I won't reprise the boilerplate, but the idea is that institutions arose from the Crown's management of principal agent problems in colonization. The book has two major parts. One is about the establishment of colonies and their institutions of governance, the role of the crown in that establishment, and how we can see the crown's consistent pursuit of political and economic objectives through the establishment of those institutions. Part two of Agents of Empire is about the persistence of these institutions, why it was indeed so difficult for the crown to externally reform these institutions once established, even though it did try through the 17th and early 18th century to do so. Today, my focus will be on part one, on the establishment and how we can understand the establishment of the institutions we got through these agency problems and early colonization. And essentially the point I want to make is if we come to a better, fuller, maybe even proper understanding of the crown's agency problems in governing its empire, then we can better interpret the institutions of government that it established in these colonies. Okay, so that's what I'm going to talk about. So the outline for what I will say to you in my remaining time is first to say how did the government actually take place? What is there to be explained in these earliest days? What are the commonalities across colonies that we can see? The second point I will address is why did they do this? The interpretive and kind of theoretical component of this. Let's explain why did it happen this way. And the third is a bit of a empirical slash historical review on how did it work out? Did it actually, how did it do in achieving the objectives of the crown that we reconstruct and visualize in their institutional development? So that's the outline. So turning back to that first question, how did they actually govern their New World colonies? The short answer is they purposely, the crown purposely, consciously created colonies with a high degree of autonomy, both relative to each other and relative to the crown. And in those colonies, in each one of those colonies, stipulated some provisions for a government internal to the colony with a separate legislature and executive in that government. These are, I want to stress, and I will give you the evidence for this claim, creations of the crown in the earliest days of colonial governance, and importantly, in the case of English colonies, imposed by agreement and by contract before colonists even left England. So relevant for how we theorize the origins of these things, these developments are happening in colonial government before they even know the resource endowments they're going to find. That's an important clue for us in interpreting these things. So in order to understand, so these are sort of the basic large scale points to be explained. Colonial autonomy, independent legislatures. How do we know they had these provisions? We look at the charters and the letters patent by which colonies were established. Our foundational myths in American schools are about how colonies came to be is that persecuted and or freedom-loving people left England, left the religious repression of the crown perhaps, made their own way, and did as they pleased. And although so that suggests a high degree of autonomy, which they indeed had, it's not exactly the case that they simply came here to the United States and did as they pleased. Rather, the structures and arrangements that the crown was willing to grant to them were spelled out in letters patent that were, I argue in my book, essentially like contracts. They were like contracts in the sense that they involved a proposal or an offer. They involved consideration of the terms of them. They involved maybe some back and forth. They involved a decision of acceptance by the recipient of the letters, and they were enforceable and protected in an independent court. In all of these ways, the letters patent by which the crown granted authority to govern these places and the crown's subjects were like contracts. They're not exactly the same as a contract. Contract could be seen as an agreement between legal equals. In no way was the crown the legal equal of the recipient of the letters patent. They were grants of largesse. They were grants, they were gifts, literally styled as presents of the crown. So there are important differences legally between letters patent and a contract, but nevertheless, they involve many of the same elements from an economic and incentive point of view. The main point to pull out of this is that these letters patent delegated powers of the crown to private actors that included powers of the crown to govern its subjects, that it said in these letters patent, it was superintending to the recipient of the letter. Could be a charter company, could be a proprietary grant holder, depending on the colony. In studying colonial history and studying American colonies and English colonies, we learn about charters like the Massachusetts Bay Charter and the Mayflower Compact and the self-styled charters of Connecticut and Rhode Island. But in English history, these are by no means new. English kings had been using letters patent in a similar way for similar purposes as they used them in the American colonies and the Caribbean colonies. They had been using them within England when the Norman conqueror, when William the Conqueror and his children, as kings in a new dynasty of England, tried to consolidate their rule in that territory. They had a stronghold in around London, but their direct authority did not extend all the way up to the borderlands of Scotland. They used letters patent in a similar way to delegate their authority in those areas. These letters patent included firm but qualified delegations of the Crown's authority to the recipient of the letter. They were enforceable, as I said, in a court, a common law court. The Court of King's Bench in England, in particular, was the English court that would hear lawsuits pursuant to letters patent. So through the letters patent, the Crown delegated its authority to govern its subjects under such and such terms. If the Crown felt that a patent recipient did not uphold its terms, the Crown could not simply say, give us the patent back. The Crown could not simply tell them, now we take over. Rather, the Crown had to prove to an English court, to the judges on King's Bench, that the recipient of the patent had not upheld the terms. That's a lawsuit. They had to file a lawsuit. They had to take the patent holder to court and prove to a judge in a lawsuit called the lawsuit of quo warranto, which is asking by what warrant does the patent holder exercise the powers of the king. Crown had to petition in court to get the patent back. If the court found in the Crown's favor, the patent was null and void, and it resumed to the king's authority. King's Bench was an independent court in the sense that English courts were independent at this time, long before the 1600s. The Crown often lost quo warranto suits in general, as best I can find, something like 30 to 50% of the time. There's very wide bounds on this number, but the Crown lost a lot of quo warranto suits. They weren't just about colonial charters. Every time the king gave someone the authority to delegated the king's authority to a private actor, this is the device they would use. And if they disagreed with how the patent holder was using it, this is the vehicle by which they reclaimed their authority. So English monopolists like the fishmongers or the drapers, all the blacksmith monopolists, all held letters patent and had to be challenged by quo warranto suits in the same way. So all of this is just sort of background to establish this is the vehicle that the England used to structure colonial government with the actual colonists on the ground. And there were firm but qualified delegations of the Crown's authority here. Crown had a whole staff of advisors to read and review the terms of these letters patent. They seem like they took it seriously. It's an important sovereign duty, and they were careful about this stuff. A point I just want to come back to is that patents specified colonial institutions and the powers of colonial government before they even got on a boat. So we have well-developed theories of geographic determinism or endowment determinism of New World institutions. The point that I really want to pull out here is there are institutions baked into letters patent that it is the legal duty of colonists to implement because the Crown said these are the terms of your grant of authority. You have to follow such and such institutions. They are written before they even got on a boat. They don't know what the endowments are of the places they went to at the time they got these patents. Just to drive this home, we see in colonies with resources as different as Maryland and Barbados, founded in 1629 in the case of Barbados, or the letters patent are issued for Barbados in 1629 and for Maryland in 1632. They're very different colonies, and they have almost identical terms in their letters patent about the use of institutions like separation of powers. So, in my view, that's an important point that makes it difficult to argue that this institution is a response to endowments or geographical conditions in the colonies because it's already written down and required by terms of this delegation before they even got to the colonies. So that's something that we can come back to later, perhaps. Okay, so in the colonial patents, a few common attributes. This is just sort of found by reviewing each one of these individually and finding what do they have in common. They have a lot of things in common. They specify in particular autonomy for the leaders of each colony over their internal economic operations. They don't have to answer to the crown. They don't have to answer to the ministry in England. They don't need permission to make it a farming colony or a mining colony or a fishing colony or a trading colony. The English ministry requires no oversight about what they do. It is like, here are extensive powers over all the resources you may find in this place. Go forth and make money. That in particular involves, in every one of these patents, long-term grants of control relative to the crown of everything, of all resources in the colony, and of the king's subjects in each colony. These are specific long-term grants of control. And because these are enforceable in the Court of King's Bench, there probably is some credibility in that long-term grant of control. And that actually does play out historically for the crown to get its charters back, which it did in almost all of these cases, except in Connecticut and Rhode Island before the Revolution. It basically had to go to court or buy these people out. It couldn't do what the Spanish crown did, which was say, yeah, about the agreement we made, we actually don't favor it anymore, so we're just going to get rid of it. Okay, there was a long-term grant of control, and it seemed fairly credible. The colonial patents required no direction or oversight of economic operations inside the colony from the crown. It wasn't because the crown didn't care. The crown definitely cared. King James I wrote a long pamphlet objecting to the emphasis on tobacco monoculture in Virginia, but that consultation with the king on what they grow was not part of the contract. So they didn't do it. They grew nothing but tobacco for a long time, and it was very lucrative. The patents required output sharing with the crown, most importantly in the form of customs duties, a small share of the output that the colonists found was to be paid to the crown in the form of customs. Otherwise, they could trade openly on the open market. Lest we conclude that the colonial patents simply gave extensive authority to the colonists to do as they pleased, that was not in all areas the case. There was an important area where the crown specifically, repeatedly enjoined its colonists and inhabitants of the colonies from getting into any fights with other European subjects. There was a real security risk for the crown in colonization. And so it was very clear in its patents, stay out of problems with other European subjects. Don't start any fights with them. And if we find out that you did, you're going to be in serious trouble. They actually meant it. That was actually how Sir Walter Raleigh finally was executed by the English state, was because of violating exactly those terms of a patent he got for a colony in South America. So they really did mean this. And so in this specific area, they showed us they had the full ability to put into these contracts terms of monitoring and sanctions, controlling what agents did. In the economic realm, they imposed zero control, long-term control for the colonists, figure out how to make money, share some with us. In the realm of security and foreign relations, much tighter control. The second major part that every single English patent, with one exception, of a New World patent. The only exception is the colonial patent for New York, obtained in 1663, which was initially from King Charles II to his brother Duke James, the Duke of York. That's the one exception of a New World colony. Of dozens of letters patent for New World colonies, every single one of them, save New York, before the American Revolution, requires an independent legislature to make laws with the colonial executive. The English crown did not create despots. It would not allow, by the terms of these letters patent, the recipient, the patent holder, be it a charter company, be it a land grant recipient, would not allow them to become despots. It required internal separation of powers, a rudimentary form for sure, but a form of separation of powers nonetheless, part of the stipulation of the crown with its colonizers. There are a couple different models or flavors of independent legislatures that the crown allowed. In some cases, it required an assembly model with election of assembly members by colonists. In other cases, the crown required a council to consult with a governor or a colonizer, a patent holder in the making of laws, and the crown itself would appoint that council. Sometimes it blended the two. Either way, we have an independent legislature not under the executive's control. There is a type of balance of powers built into the colonial constitution expressed through these letters patent. These are the main features of letters patent. And just as to governmental powers in the colonies, the legislature and executive could together, if they agreed, could legislate quite broadly on internal affairs and taxes within the colony, public goods provision, things like that. But the governor of a colony or the patent holder of a colony could not do so on its own, required that consultation. These attributes are what I refer to in my book as contractual imperialism. It is a policy of imperial governance through contracts that delegate authority. So what I want to do is take just a few examples of blocks of text to actually say, what do these provisions actually look like in the letters patent, and then talk a little bit about why did they do it. So just in terms of long-term control, an important part of the argument I make is that the crown is giving away economic autonomy, and it's doing so on a long-term basis. It's not giving a short-term lease in almost any of these cases to the patent holder who received the title to this colony. It's giving away long-term control. So here's an example from Maryland in 1632. We, our heirs and successors, this is the crown speaking, this is the king, specifically the king speaking, this is King Charles I speaking, and specifically saying, not only myself, that's the royal we, literally, not only myself, but my children, my successors, everybody who becomes king after me will respect this grant of authority to the Baron of Baltimore, to his heirs, and to anybody that he assigns. That part of the peninsula between the ocean and Chesapeake Bay may entirely remain accepted forever to us, our heirs and successors. That is about as clear as you can get of a long-term grant to Lord Baltimore. The scope that and all these patents have examples of this. The one in Barbados has it, Massachusetts Bay has it, the Virginia patent has it. They all have them. That's just an example for Maryland. The resource scope, what I mean by that is that the crown is delegating control, the ability to extract resources of whatsoever kind the colonists may discover. It's important that it tries to, it's important in my theory, the crown expresses these grants extremely broadly. The reason why it has to give such a broad expression is it doesn't know what they're going to find. They don't know what resources are there. They need to understand their own, they do understand their own ignorance. They plan for it. So we yield and grant all the said parts of New England, this is to Massachusetts Bay, all the said parts of New England, lands, grounds, places, soils, woods, wood grounds, havens, ports, rivers, waters, mines, minerals, jurisdictions, rights, royalties, liberties, freedoms, immunities, privileges, and blah, 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 hereditaments and commodities whatsoever. That's like everything they could think of. Anything we could think of belongs to you. That's a very broad grant of the scope of resources. As far as the control over the king's subjects, this is the legal scope of authority or control over people. This is, if you're in the business of being a king in 1606, this is serious business. The king had a solemn duty to govern his subjects and was delegating this duty to the Virginia Company in this case. This is the first Virginia charter, received full and absolute power to devise statutes, ordinances, and proceedings as near as conveniently may be to the laws of our realm of England. Okay, that's a broad grant of authority subject to that proviso, which did become important later. Broad grants of control of very long term. These are just examples. There are lots of them. The patents were specific in how they granted the patent recipients, the colonial elites, freedom from oversight and direction by the crown. They didn't have to ask the crown's permission. They didn't have to ask the ministry. They didn't have to listen to any bureaucrats as to what would you like us to try to find here, or what do you think would be a good mode of economic operation, what would be useful to the crown. None of that is going to be part of how these colonies are governed. And the reason they don't have to ask is because the patent said so. So in the case of the first Virginia patent, it says the said colonies shall lawfully may, without any interruption of us, give and take order to dig, mine, and search for all manner of mines of gold, silver, and copper. Do this, look for it. You don't need any more permission from us. Do as you please in the area of mining. You're not going to hear an interruption from us if we tell you, hey, we'd rather you try to find white pine masts greater than 4 inches because we need to build a bunch of boats. And then we think you probably have a bunch of these things over there. So instead of mining, why don't you have people try to cut those masts down? You're not going to hear that. It says right here, without any interruption of us. In the case of a few years later, Virginia reissued a charter more suitable to a farming colony. Once they figured out, they spent a few years almost getting annihilated a few times and learning they were not, if there were any gold and silver in Virginia, they would not find it easily. So they put it on a firmer footing as a farming colony, which required the elites of the colony to be able to distribute land to farmers. The colonists, instead of being miners, would then become farmers. So the company, the Virginia Company, shall distribute and set over such particular lands as the planters of the said company shall be allowed. They have the authority to make land grants, delegated authority. You get your land grants from the colony. You don't have to get it from the crown. As far as the crown is concerned, this is a big deal. The crown is the ultimate owner of all land held under the crown's name. Indian, North American, Native American, Indian claims, other European, Spanish claims notwithstanding, as far as the English crown was concerned at this time, that's the crown's land. It was giving authority to grant to subgrant to the Virginia Company. The response to Crown demands was limited. Here's a grant to the Massachusetts Bay. As long as you pay us the royal fifth of gold and silver, that is for all respect and manner of duties and demands and services whatsoever may be done to us, the Crown. That discharged the obligations of the patent holders to the Crown. So these are, again, very extensive grants of authority. The requirement of output sharing with the crown, which is ultimately what we think is the economic side, the economic rationale for what's happening here, is built into a couple of terms. One is a specified share of precious metals to be shared with the crown, the royal fifth. Now, this might seem a little quaint because, as we all know now, there was no gold and silver in Virginia, nor in Massachusetts Bay, nor in Maryland. They didn't know that. They didn't know what they were going to find. And as far as the Spanish inspiration that the English colonists certainly knew about and motivated some of them to go to Virginia and some of these colonies. They didn't know what they were going to find in terms of precious metals. So it was only prudent for the crown to say, we'll get our royal fifth and our royal 15th of copper. On everything else besides precious metals, the requirement of output sharing comes out in the form of taxes, English customs, which are spelled out quite specifically. They're actually given a tax break on all taxes, including customs, for 7 years, and all taxes and impositions, save customs, for 21 years. The very purpose of this seems to be to give them a little breathing room before they owe their rents to the crown to get established as a colony. But within the space of 7 years, no customs. After that, pay your customs duties. For the first 21 years, between 7 and 21 years, it says here only the £5 per for customs duties upon all goods and merchandises as after the said 7 years shall be expired, imported into our realm of England. So that's a form of output sharing. Doesn't seem like much. It seems like that's conceding a lot of the output to the colonists themselves. That's nevertheless an important source of revenue, and in time, with the value of tobacco in Virginia, an enormous source of revenue to the Crown of England, as it would turn out to be in later years. So this is built into these terms, how they went about this output sharing. Just back to that point about foreign affairs, this is just so interesting to me. You can read these terms on economic affairs and say, well, maybe the crown is putting in place, is being sort of self-conscious about the autonomy it's delegating, or maybe they just give lots of authority to these colonists, and it's really just more of a position of just do whatever you want to do over there. When you get to the parts about foreign affairs, you see that's really not the case. In the case of foreign affairs, the crown explicitly promises and requires a regime of essentially monitoring and sanctions. It will monitor and might sanction, in case of necessity, the misbehavior of its subjects in the colonies with respect to other European princes. So here they're actually addressing, here they say, we hereby declare to all Christian kings, princes, and states that if any person of the said colonies shall do any act of unlawful hostility to your subjects, then we shall make open proclamation within all of our ports that person will be out of our must make restitution to your subjects, and if they don't, they will be out of our protection, and it will be lawful for you to go after them. This was, again, not an empty threat. There were several cases of impounding tobacco ships in ports of England, in cases of English colonists who had done wrong on the high seas, piracy essentially, to Spanish ships. And as I said, in the case of Walter Raleigh, ultimately why he was imprisoned in the Tower of London and executed on an old death warrant from Elizabethan times, but ultimately was executed for his crimes against Spanish colonists in South America. So they meant business and were fully capable of implementing a regime of monitoring and sanctions. So as to the other major pillar of colonial governance, the other side of it is this independent legislature, or checks and balances, proto separation of powers, if you will, within colonial governance. Two models. One is an appointed council model, where the crown actually writes down on a separate document, sealed with the royal seal, or sealed with the privy seal, at the time the colonists disembarked from England, seals the names of the counselors who will, by royal appointment, be on the governor's council. That's what happened with Virginia in its earliest days. That's what happened with in Massachusetts Bay. It was actually the freemen, the full members of the Puritan Church, which was a minority of the colony, formed the assembly and then chose the council and the governor. Massachusetts Bay, very much an elite and narrow dominated operation, not in any way attempting to spread freedom broadly. That's just not what they were up to there. The other model is an elected assembly model. This was mostly true for proprietary colonies like Maryland and Barbados. In Barbados in 1629, the patent requires the approval of, quote, the free inhabitants of the said province or the greater part of them thereunto to be called for the approval of legislation. Very similar, as I said, in the case of Maryland. Okay, so again, these are colonies with very different resource bases, very different slave economies, very different revenue bases. The level of inequality in Barbados is profound, and in Maryland was high, but not to that anywhere near that degree. Maryland was a tobacco colony. The rich people of Maryland were simply not that much richer in the relative to as they were in Barbados, where it was really a stunning disparity. Very similar institutions requiring this independence of a legislative body in the colony. Very similar institutions in that way. And other colonies blended these two models together, such as Jamaica in 1660. Okay, so that's a summary and a brief textual review of what they did, how they governed, what was in the letters patent. The next question is why? And that's where we get to the political economy side of this. Obviously, there's a ton written on why were English colonies governed as they were. One is in the history literature, we see predominant accounts in the early days of the colonies of royal indifference and other accounts of simple institutional exportation, neither of which I think really work. The crown was too careful, put too many good people on this, and knew there was too much at stake to actually simply be indifferent about it. Reserved in high-level diplomatic negotiations with Spain, authority to send colonists to the New World. Spain didn't agree, but they raised it. They understood the delicacy here. It just seems implausible that it's like, well, whatever you guys want to do, go ahead and give it a try. And the institutional exportation story really doesn't have a lot of serious academic defenses because there's no real justification for it. In truth, the institutions imported were quite different from what the crown itself was trying to implement in England. The terms of a letters patent were 100% the creation of the crown. These were the crown's territories to govern. They were not a matter of parliament. We're talking about the Stuart kings writing letters of patent. We're talking about Charles II was executed by Charles I was executed by his own parliament because of his supposed attempts, or in their view, attempts to suppress or circumvent the separation of powers as they understood it in the parliamentary power in England. This is not a person who was known to just love parliamentary authority and independent legislatures. This was not how they seemed to want to govern their own polity. And yet they wrote into these letters patent these protections and requirements of institutional separation. So, and nor was it's not, it doesn't bear scrutiny to say that this was simply the choice of the colonists themselves. Wasn't their choice, and nor would it necessarily be their interest. Why does the proprietor of Barbados, the Earl of Carlisle in particular, want to consult with the planters on the laws that he passes? That isn't necessarily what he would want to do. If I were the Earl of Carlisle, I would probably say, here's a law I would like, we're going to do this now. And the patents say specifically, you can't do it that way. So those arguments or those explanations, in my view, don't work real well. Recent work in political science and political economy emphasizes endowment determinism. One take on this is Acemoglu and Robinson. This is more in line with what they write in Why Nations Fail than in their journal articles of the early 2000s, but they talk specifically about land abundance, the absence of Native Americans, meaning colonists have good exit options, and liberal institutions within the colonies reduce the value to colonists of exercising those exit options. Basically, the idea of Western exit for colonists as a constraint on what the colonizers can do. Um, Limitations of this is that it simply doesn't account for the textual basis in the letters patent, which are creations of the crown. It also, in my view, overstates the value in the very earliest days of Western exit. The idea that Puritans in Massachusetts are simply going to leave their little foothold of what they see as civilization to just go live wherever it is not plausible, nor in Virginia for that matter. So in the very early, maybe at one time that does become plausible, but in the very earliest days, not really. Uh, in the interest of time, I won't review all of these explanations, but there's stories about the metropolitan ceiling of colonial liberalizing colonial institutions, or Gehring et al. Have a book on basically the racial origins of these institutions, that white racial homogeneity of colonizers tends to be associated with strong independent legislatures many years later. That association may be, it is what it is. That's a correlation. Anybody can see it. But as a causal story, it leaves a lot to be desired. I can return to all this later. In the interest of time, I'm not going to belabor this. All of these, though, do elide the affirmative role of the crown that I think is important because these are letters patent. So, what do I think, and how do I explain these things? Returning to the crown's objectives and being realistic about the crown's problems. The crown wanted to make money from colonies to gain power in Europe. These are objectives: security and money. Its constraints are pretty profound. We talk about state capacity. That's a little bit of like it's a very flexible term. Analytically, I don't often know what it does, but one like nuts and bolts, a real constraint. No one involved knew how to make money in the New World. They didn't really know. They thought maybe we'll find silver, maybe we'll find gold mines like the Spanish did. That was the best guess they had. Nobody had any real idea how to make it. Grow tobacco wasn't even remotely close to the mind of the Virginia planters for a dozen years when they planted this colony. They had no real idea. Furthermore, the crown could not operationally control operations on the ground, even if they did know how to make money. Even if they did know that the right thing to grow in Barbados was sugar, that's the most lucrative use of this place, promotes the economic objectives of the crown, didn't have the organizational wherewithal to run a sugar plantation from London, couldn't do it. Couldn't restrain colonizers dominating each other, extracting from colonists, pushing colonial elites, pushing mass colonizers to the brink of subsistence, and raising problems of internal stability as a result of that. Those are all real constraints on the crown. Constraints of knowledge of production, constraints of operation of production, and constraints of which are kind of economic agency problems, like how do you make money in this place? How do I ensure you exert a lot of effort to make money once we find out? The crown's not in a position to ensure either one of those things. And they're complemented by a political agency problem. Make sure the people who run the colony don't extract too much from the mass of colonists that actually carry out the production. How do you stop the leaders of a colony from dominating, extracting, repressing, from the mass of colonists that actually do the work? Pretty hard to do from 3,000 miles away. Pretty hard to just tell them, hey, don't take too much money from these people. So those are real constraints on the crown's authority, and they translate into agency problems between the crown and its colonizers, the colonial elites who run a colony. When we think about why the institutions of government looked like they did, we could start to see why when we think of them as resolutions of these agency problems. And that is, my argument, what contractual imperialism did. And in particular, the indefinite long-term contracts, broad grants of resources, physical and human, lack of requirement for oversight and direction by the crown, and limited output sharing all amount to very strong incentives for colonizers to risk their lives and those of colonists to figure and endure uncertain, unknown, and to them, and in part because of their own actions, but nevertheless to them, dangerous conditions to figure out how to make a lot of money in these places. It provides a really strong incentive to do that. The long horizon of the letters patent means that if you incur very high upfront costs to search for endowments, you can repay those costs in a long flow of output over many years. Lack of oversight and direction from the crown and a broad grant of control of resources means that the colonists have immense flexibility to extract whatever resources they find, and if necessary, to remake their economy to extract the resources that they encounter. The assurance of a large share of output granted to the colonizers provides a strong incentive for maximal extraction and operations of whatever endowments they happen to find. It's a real good assurance that, in the case of simply a moral hazard problem, it's a very high commitment of the output to the agent themselves, which is a strong incentive to gather a lot of it. So all of this amounts to, and this is kind of elaborated in the book, but in brief, all of this amounts to the economic terms of contractual imperialism provide strong incentives to colonists to find the most valuable endowments and extract them. And if we think about alternative modes of government more directly under the control of the state, it is difficult to see how they would have been as successful. Despite all the many problems they did have in their economic operations, English colonies did figure out how to make a lot of money in these places. Then on the side of the political agency problem, how do you prevent a colonizer from extracting too much from its colonists? That could be a dangerous, costly problem for the crown. Could destabilize a colony, create a problem that requires intervention. That would be very costly for the crown to intervene externally. How do we minimize this from happening? A solution to this is a balanced colonial constitution that presents internally divided authority over lawmaking. It means that it created a larger set of elites who wanted a cut of whatever extraction they took from mass colonists beneath them. A larger share of people in the colony who would lose out if the colonial government took more from settlers than they would tolerate. It acts essentially as a tax on the executive's extraction from colonists and ensures that there's less total extraction from colonists by the colonizers. The crown knows some of this is going to happen. The colonial elites are going to enrich themselves by extracting from mass colonists. They just need to keep a lid on it so that the colony remains stable. That's, as I argue, the point of this proto-separation of powers. It's a mechanism that does not depend on empowering the settlers, and it doesn't depend on Western exit options for colonists. Okay, so that's essentially the theoretical argument for why this works. Now you can see the importance of this as a contractual solution really requires strong legal capacity of the colonizing state. This Court of King's Bench, as a superintendent of an independent superintendent of letters patent, really matters for this story. Okay, so how did it work out? Very briefly, the colonizers did in fact incur large costs, many deaths, loss of life, risks to lives. Not to dramatize it or make it, to present a narrative of heroism, but lots of them really did die, and they really did incur large costs to figure out, what can we do here? How can we make money here? They really did make and remake their economies very quickly in light of new information. What we really need to think about here is, how did it come to be that Virginia figured out that tobacco is the most lucrative use of that colony? How did they do that? The reason why I argue, the reason why they did that is underwritten by the extremely strong financial incentives built into their letters patent, built into their charter. How did Barbados figure out? First, Barbados is they first tried as a tobacco plantation. Barbados is not a great place to grow tobacco. Then they figured out they could try cotton. It turns out it's not a great place to grow cotton either. As they cure the product, it gets moldy because of the climate. Finally, in the 1640s, they start to figure out you can grow sugar here. Nobody had any idea 20 years into this colony that that's what they were going to do. When they figured it out, and it's Brazilian plantationers who helped show them how to set up a sugar plantation, the economy was remade totally within 10 years. And it became the most lucrative English colony of the century. So just in the case of Virginia, as they persisted through near starvation, near annihilation several times, only 10 years after initial settlement do they figure out how to start growing tobacco. New charter response to it, land distribution, it becomes a tobacco monoculture within 15 years. That's a product of extremely strong incentives built into these institutions in the letters patent. That's the story of Barbados I just told you about. Governance. Our narratives, if we may have them, of a harmonious, freedom-loving people bent on a project of political equality, don't bear the historical weight, the historical experience of the early colonies. These people tried to dominate each other. Colonizers, the elites of colonies tried to dominate their settlers politically. That's true from Barbados to Massachusetts Bay. It's true in Virginia in a document called the Laws Divine, Moral, and Martial, an extremely draconian set of laws of political and economic domination by colonial elites. It's true in Massachusetts Bay, where the governor and council tried to concentrate all power in their own hands at the expense of the assembly. Checks and balances in the colonial patents restrained the governors and the colonizing elites from doing so. They pushed as hard as they could. The elites pushed as hard as they could against this, but there really was restraint in the political balance required by their charters. You can see here in the case of Virginia asking the king in 1624, after the king royalizes the Virginia patent, here the key point is the end here. They're saying the governor, Sir Thomas Smith, aims at nothing more than a particular gain to himself, to be raised out of labors from people like us. They're complaining to the king, all this guy wants to do is extract from us for his own gain. So they say, howsoever it pleaseth his majesty to dispose of us. They know it is completely the king's decision how to govern this place. It is our humble desire that the governors that are sent over may not have absolute authority, but may be restrained by the consent of this council. They're asking the king, please give us a role in this government so our governors don't extract too much from us, because it'll destabilize this place. Okay. There were real problems in contractual imperialism. I don't mean to oversell its effectiveness. It did do some things really well, but this mutual colonial autonomy created a problem of market saturation in tobacco. Every colony wants to be a tobacco colony for 15 years. The tobacco market collapses. The English government seemed not to understand. It certainly didn't have the tools to understand the problems of correlated endowments and market saturation. It created the extremely strong incentives, financial incentives built into contractual imperialism, invited factional conflict within colonies. We certainly saw that play out in Virginia. It played out in Barbados for a time, other examples as well. And it gave strong incentives for elites to dominate colonial assembly, to collude with colonial assemblies wherever possible, which did play out in Bacon's rebellion in Virginia in the 1670s. But despite those problems, I think the most important one is contractual imperialism was very hard for the crown to change later. This is like what they needed to do to establish colonies. It was quite good. at incentivizing the search for information about endowments. But once the colonizers had that information, replacing the colonial elites with the crown's handpicked authorities was extremely hard. That basically is the story of colonial politics for 100 years. And that's what I cover in part 2 of the book. So here I am, an hour into this, as requested. So we have a story in part 1 of this book of colonial autonomy and legislative independence are built into English colonization from the very early to the letters patent. These are essential parts of the institutions of American government reflected and built into the US Constitution. Mutually independent states, states as units of political authority, separation of powers, the mutual independence of states giving rise to the need for federalism, all of that traces directly to this. These are not bargained up by colonists or colonizers. They're not baked into resource geographies. They're not baked into human geographies. These institutions served the crown's interests in the sense of resolving or mitigating principal agent problems. It provided incentives for colonizing agents in particular to identify endowments and then to extract them. And it mitigated incentives for colonizing elites to dominate the colonists below them, which would have been to the detriment of the crown. So in part that's in summary what I do in part 1 of this book. And part 2 is why couldn't the crown unravel this structure later when it wanted to take more control? But perhaps I come back to you another time and talk about that. Okay, so thank you for your attention. That's my part of the presentation today. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Sean. Thank you for the presentation. So we have a couple of questions already. So we have 15 minutes. If you have more questions, please use the Q&A section. So let's start with the broadest one, which basically asks you more about not just the presentation today, but your views on mostly kind of the history of the US as a whole. So do you see the United States merely as a continuation of British colonial institution, or was the revolution a breaking point that created new ones, or just cemented the previous colonial ones, or did neither and had no effect at all?
That's a fascinating question. The revolution and the period of constitution writing after it was a break. They really did they re-theorized the foundation of these institutions. That's not merely rearrange just sort of a theoretical nicety. That actually changes our understanding of what do these things do, why do we have them, and how will they develop over time. So I think it changes the trajectory that these institutions are on and that American politics is on. I mean, you know, shortly after his death, I could certainly say there's no better exponent of this than Gordon Wood, whose book, The Creation of the American Republic, just brilliantly kind of stands up so well, even 50 years later, the constitution making of the 1780s at the state level, all the experimentation and theorizing, what do these institutions do, is a really important change in direction. So it's not just the formal arrangement of powers, but our understanding of what they do. That is part of the future of American political development under these institutions. So I think what you have with the colonial period is you're setting the stage and you're putting out the ingredients that can sort of be rearranged in the US Constitution. But it's not simply a the Constitution period and the Revolution is not simply a reconstitution, a rearrangement of what these formal institutions do. It actually changes the trajectory. But that's a fascinating question and issue.
So we have a couple of questions that more or less, not challenge, but are more or less take into account your critique of endowments as explaining the different outcomes of the many English colonies today. And I will read a couple just. So Canada, Barbados, and the United States, to name a few, all inherited English colonial institutions. What made the US different, and how much of that difference do you think was already baked in before 1776?
That's a fantastic question, such an interesting issue. And I think a lot of it is baked in. I mean, there's a lot of work in economic history where you could see, you know, the endowments really are different. That has a huge effect. The slave economy of Barbados is totally remade as a slave economy before 1700. And its endowments are a huge part of that. I guess one of the things I want to say is like, what was the political economic structure that allowed the colonizers to make their economies so flexibly and remake them in response to endowments that they identified? That in itself is institutionally mediated fact of colonial governance. And so it is the very flexibility built into contractual imperialism that allows the reaction to these endowments that we see over time. And you can also see, like, for instance, you know, um, but what happens after independence matters a lot too. Like Puerto Rico has a higher per capita income than almost any other former Spanish colony by by some margin. The reason for that uh, seems obviously to have something to do with attachment to the United States long after colonial institutions are all set in motion and long after they're gone. Um, so there is this huge variation within these colonial empires in developmental experiences. An empire as large as the British Empire was territorially expansive and covered such a wide range of endowments. It obviously does have a huge range of developmental experiences, um, but it puts us back to in a way, the position that Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson were in 2001 in writing the original paper about colonial and origins of comparative development, which is, yes, we can see this variation in developmental outcomes in these places. That's apparent to all of us. And we can see variation in the institutions that they had, but how do we square the circle of saying, did the same things that cause the institutions also cause future developmental outcomes? Or were there, institutions put in place that, channeled their long-term development at that moment and forever after? So one thing I think is clear is that, the idea that inclusive institutions, I don't know that, I mean, I don't know how much stock people put in this particular side of their very expansive argument at this point, but the idea that these particular variation in where colonial settlers expected to live affects whether they developed inclusive institutions is an argument that I find hard to square with how similar these institutions were across very different places. Again, Barbados and Maryland in 1630, starting out with almost identical stipulations for what we would call inclusive institutions. And not to overstate it, it doesn't make an entire legislature, but everything that happens after that is after endowments are discovered. So to me, it puts you closer to like Engerman and Sokolov, that geographies and endowments determine these institutions because colonizers get there and make their institutions in light of what they see, than it is with that particular strand of Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, which held that settler mortality was itself this key conditioning factor. Like that's just hard to square with the fact that these things are all identical at the time of their patents.
In the same line, we have another question that says, "It seems to me that the English crown from day one was more interested in governing directly the Caribbean colonies rather than the North American ones. For example, Jamaica was seized after an official attempt to take Cuba that failed, but resulted in taking Jamaica."
That's a really interesting argument. I mean, I would say, like, by the time we're talking about Jamaica, we're 45, 50 years into English colonization. The Virginia companies founded in 1606. They get Jamaica in the Western design, and what was it, 1660? Um, And once Jamaica is Jamaica claiming Jamaica agreed is a direct act of the state, a direct act of state conquest, a very rare one in the case of English colonies, and one that involved England's competition with Spain rather than England's interest in controlling colonies per se. So I think that as you think about the what does the Jamaican example mean, to me, you have to refract that through the geopolitical conflict with Spain rather than an attempt to finally directly govern a colony. Because once Jamaica is established, it's handled basically the same way all the other colonies are handled, which is a lot of autonomy, de facto, a lot of independence,
Mm.
independent legislature model. Jamaica gets a blended council model within a very short period of time after initial foundation. It's true that Jamaica wasn't governed through letters patent in the same, you didn't have a king at that time. That was an act of parliament. This is during the interregnum. You didn't have a king to issue letters patent. But the actual governing model ends up being really similar in Jamaica as in other places. So I think less a case of an attempt to govern directly and more a case of an attempt to take stuff from Spain.
So you mentioned Raleigh as an example of the crown enforcing its limits on colonial agents, but plenty of English privateers were raiding the Spanish coast with what amounted to tacit crown's approval. So how credible was really the enforcement threat in practice?
Great, that's such a fantastic point. The English, I would agree with that to such an extent of going well beyond tacit crown approval and say quite explicit crown approval for English privateering. The main difference is the English crown supported privateers explicitly in the 16th century before it succeeded in the colonizing business.
Mm.
That is when, again, that is how you kind of take your shots at Imperial Spain and drag them down a notch. The English didn't have any foothold in the New World that they would have to worry about. So there's no downside for them. By the time they get their own colonies, the Crown's explicit support for many reasons, not just for colonization, but for many reasons of geopolitics, the Crown's explicit support for privateers declines a great deal. And in fact, they back to the point about Jamaica. Jamaica was an infamous hotbed of pirates and privateers for many years. The English crown wanted to eradicate them. It failed to do so, but it really did try. Um, I think that you have to sort of consider this in the broad scope of what are England's strategies for engaging in geopolitical conflict with Spain, and what are its own interests in the New World. By the time England gets its own colonies and has vested interest in stability in the New World, it kind of changes its tune a little bit as to support of privateers. But absolutely, in the 16th century, they made lots of money. Walter Raleigh became, I think, what you would call a billionaire in modern terms that way.
Now, some questions regarding colonial governance and the role of the crown itself. So, did the crown have any mechanisms for managing relationships between the colonies themselves? So, did the crown have any way of coordinating or arbitrating disputes between, say, Maryland and Pennsylvania?
That's such a great question. Everything was ad hoc uh, until the Board of Trade created originally I mean, they tried a couple of lords of trade and foreign plantations, became the Board of Trade in the late 1600s. And the Board of Trade as of the 18th century would be the institution for handling first line of disputes. But the colonial governance is pretty well established by that time. Through the 18th century, sorry, I beg your pardon, through the 17th century, as it's establishing and consolidating colonial presence, it has no real institutions, no institutionalized mechanisms for this arbitration. It's all ad hoc. And there were disputes, especially in the case of New England. The colonists in New England themselves came up with a Council for New England, which was dominated by Massachusetts Bay. And in fact, Massachusetts Bay used it as a vehicle for basically satellite colonies in New Hampshire, and in Maine, which basically how they dispossessed people who had received letters patent to have to govern colonies in those places. The Massachusetts people were like, well, we filled it with our settlers, and so go ahead and try to get them out. But by the way, they have firearms and they won't take kindly to you trying to evict them. So they had sort of local models of doing that, but the Crown's ability to do this was all pretty ad hoc. I think a blind spot of contractual imperialism is its inability to arbitrate conflicts across colonies. But super interesting issue.
In a similar vein, someone asks, did the colonial assemblies represent the crown when dealing with Native Americans, or how the negotiations with them occurred?
Excellent. That's a great question. Colonial assemblies uh, were not sort of like solemnly sworn representatives of the crown. That would be a colonial governor was, and would have specific instructions as to what were their uh, duties to the crown in negotiation with Native Americans. This became particularly important in the 18th century. And often this was a locus of conflict between governors and their assemblies. Assemblies wanted, fairly open access to Native Americans for purposes of trade, and usually it was governors who were saying restrict access to it because, I mean, number one, it would keep the trade more lucrative if it was, from their point of view, if it was more restricted. And number two, it could easily get out of hand because the colonists didn't know a lot of colonists didn't know what they were doing as far as diplomatic
Mhm.
interactions with Native Americans were concerned. So it could easily get out of hand and cause conflicts. To avoid both of those problems, the crown seemed to want to restrict access to Native American trade. So that was really a source of conflict. It was a major flashpoint in Bacon's rebellion in Virginia, actually, was access to Native American trade, which Governor Berkeley in Virginia severely restricted, not because the crown wanted him to, he wasn't listening to the crown, but because it was, again, more lucrative for him to control it all. But so that was really something that governors were charged with representing the crown and doing.
Well, I think we've reached the end of the questions. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you. Thanks for the great questions and for the opportunity to present this. I appreciate everyone's attention so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. So just a reminder, we will continue the course next week on Tuesday, where we'll continue talking about the colonial aspects of the United States and North America.